React, Angular, and Vue. My name is Bill Wolff. I'm a Microsoft MVP, independent consultant. I go under the company name Agility Systems. I've been doing this stuff for about 38 years. And most of my work right now, I work in large Fortune 500 companies. And I do, my specialty is something called AppOps. AppOps is different from DevOps. So DevOps would be creating code, deploying it, continuous integration, deployment, stuff like that. What I do is keep track of lots and lots of websites, about 1,500 running on 800 servers. And then doing a lot of monitoring with Azure App Insights, things like that, to make sure that all of them are running. A lot of our clients are very big companies like Amazon and Microsoft. So you have to make sure that stuff is running all the time. And if it isn't, I have to be informing the right support people, to jump on the problem. So now, as part of that adventure, I write a lot of in-house tools. And that's where I use these frameworks. So as I said, I'm a Microsoft MVP. I've been an MVP for 15 years, but I've been working in Microsoft, in the Microsoft stack for well over 30 years. And so we are going to take a look at 3 popular JavaScript frameworks. And they have the names Vue, Angular, and React. Now, how many of you use React? Okay, that's that side of the room. Okay, how many use Angular? That's that side of the room. Okay. And how many love Vue? That's only one of us. Way to go. What's that? Okay, so I have a very simple chart up here, and this talk isn't really about deciding which framework to use. Many times that's out of your control. Depending on the company you're working on, you may be the lead person, or there's an architect involved that's going to dictate which framework is going to be used. Sometimes you get to work in greenfield projects. How many people have worked in a greenfield project, in other words, a brand new project, in the last 3 months? So that's, probably 20% here. So a lot of us end up maintaining things that have been out there for a while. And the honest truth is that there's a lot of web work out there. There's a lot of JavaScript. There's a ton of people still using jQuery. How many of you still maintain jQuery in some fashion? That doesn't surprise me. I have to do that too. So, but this is sort of the new jQuery. These frameworks can do a lot of wonderful things. They can make wonderful front ends and very useful for making single-page applications. Now, React was developed by which company? Facebook, that is correct. And they actually use that technology on their sites. And if you look at the red line here on the chart, you'll see React's been around a lot longer. They came out with their initial effort well over, this is a 5-year time span. So they came out with their initial effort over 5 years ago. And you can see that, there was an awful lot of excitement, then it sort of leveled off. I'm sorry, that was my mistake. Angular is the one that's red. Angular came out before React, and Angular came from Google. And yes, Google uses it in a lot of their websites too. They use their own framework. So what happened with Angular? Angular had a 1.x version, and that's the initial graph you see on the left here. So there was a lot of interest in that. And then somewhere along the way, they decided to switch and rewrite the whole framework. And that got some people a little upset. That's why there's a little dip in interest here. But it's been going pretty steady since then. And the one that is the newest is Vue. And Vue is actually done by, not by a company, but done by a guy and a bunch of other contributors in open source. And he used to work for Google. So he sort of took what he thought worked in their framework and looked at React and sort of distilled it down to something simpler. We can certainly take questions at the end of this if those of you that want to be opinionated and decide which framework you think is best. These days, they all run about the same speed. They've all been optimized. They all have the same basic features. They're all component-based. You're going to find that React is a little more code-oriented, and it comes with less in the box, so you have to buy or acquire add-ons. Angular is the biggest, has the most functionality, also takes probably the most effort to learn. And Vue is sort of simple and lightweight and easy to approach. If those of you that want to find a job, which one should you pick? Either Angular or React, because that's where most of the activity is. There's going to be, over the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be a lot of work in both of those products. There's going to be maintenance work, there's going to be new projects, so you can't go wrong. What I want to show you today is how similar they are in concept and in syntax, so that you can mentally sort of migrate one to the other. And if you get into a situation with your boss, the architect at work or something, you can actually say, hey, you know, maybe we should look at this framework because I saw the syntax and I think it's better for us. So let's jump in and be very clear. Bill doesn't do slides. So there will be no slides. There's only OneNote. Everything you know should be in OneNote, because you forget. Okay, so I've done this lab before. I've done this talk a number of times before. So you're going to see some samples here that were actually developed about 6 months ago for one of the code camps I run. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into examples of all three, React, Vue, and Angular, but we're going to use, instead of Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, we're going to use an online service called Code Sandbox. How many have used that? Very few, okay. There's another one called StackBlitz that compares favorably with it. And what this does is it uses a lot of the same technology that's in Visual Studio Code, so that you can actually edit your source code online and save it and share it, put it up to GitHub and things like that. So let's do this. Let's go out to React. And there's one project. And let's go out to Vue. That's the second project. And let's go out to Angular. So that quickly, I have loaded 3 different projects in the 3 different frameworks. Now let's go back to React. We're going to start at React. Now, it's a very simple application. When I first wrote this, this actually looks and compares football statistics. I'm a sports guy. And this is designed to show you the basic, you know, a starter app, single page app, that has multiple views, and the views are addressable by URL. And that is what is called a routed application. The interface here is Code Sandbox. So if I click on the top left, I could create a new project and share it. It saves everything online for me. I can go edit the properties of the project. I can look at the files. I can take the project and put it up on GitHub so that I can then load it into my Visual Studio. I can deploy it, maybe to Azure websites. I can go in, play around with some extra files here, and there's even a version, for those of you that have actually tried Visual Studio Live, where you can connect to somebody else and pair a program. You can do that online here. So this is an excellent way to actually experiment and look at code, and you can go out, and there are hundreds and hundreds, I would say thousands and thousands of examples that might meet your needs. And all of my stuff is up here. You just go to Code Sandbox, search for my name, and you'll see probably 2 or 3 dozen projects. Okay, So the other thing you need to know, you got your file or solution list on the left, you got your source code in the middle. You can go in and look at the console, you can look at your test results, things like that, and then you get a little browser preview window. If you want to look at your code, you can also play with the location of this, and then of course you can hide it if you want to just look at the code. So that's the whole premise here. Now, we're going to go back to my notes. And the first thing we want to look at, is package.json and dependencies. So if you want to tear these things apart, I would always start with package.json. And in the case of React, it says, I want the latest version of React, React DOM, and React Router DOM. So it's broken into 3 different pieces. Notice that there's a main. Main says, I want you to start at index.js. So you have to run that piece of code first. If I take a look at index.js, well, let's do this. Let's look at the dependencies. You'll see that React, and I know it's really, really hard for you to see that, but it's at version 16.5.2. Very light here, and the projector isn't enough contrast for you to see that. So that's about where things are in React. They're at 16.5. Then what's going to happen when you run this project, it's going to load these 3 libraries. And how does it do that? Well, let's go to index.js. And in ECMAScript 2015 and above, you use what's called an import statement. So if I want to use React, I import React from some file. And then I import the React DOM. Now, does anyone know what the difference is between importing React and importing render inside of curly braces? Good thing to know. Render is a piece, like a couple methods inside of React DOM. So instead of loading the entire thing in the memory, it just loads that one little piece. And same thing goes with browser router, which I'll explain very shortly. Okay, so everybody remember what this one looks like. Let's take a look at Vue. Vue does basically the same thing. I can make NFL conference division. I'm changing colors, not too fancy. So what does its package JSON look like? Well, the difference is it broke everything into 2 files instead of 3. If we look at the dependencies, you will see that Vue is now at version 2.5, and Vue Router is at version 3.0. Not important that you remember that. What does index.js do? Well, just like React, it has to import those main pieces, but it takes a different approach to things. It actually creates an instance of Vue. This is sort of like jQuery did in the old days. You make a new Vue, and then you pass it a JavaScript object, and that object configures it. And it says, use the element app, inject the router. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Use this template. Template is the markup, the HTML, and apply these components. So a component is something that you could write and put in a separate file, and you'll notice that the component app is actually imported from a file called /app. Going back and comparing that to React, in React, we don't make a new view, we use a method called render. So render is going to then take app, and when you do render, you can actually put your HTML right in the middle of JavaScript. It seems unnatural, but it works. And in the world of React, they call this a JSX file. So JavaScript with markup. Okay? And then you have to say, well, I want to get element by ID and throw that into root. So that's sort of more jQuery-like. Where do you think root lives? Index HTML. It's just a div with an ID of root. So that's where I'm going to put the results of any code that React renders. Let's go back to this side. Notice that the template here says app. And app is loaded from app. Well, let's look at app.view. Aha. App.view has a div with an ID of app. And it has markup in it. Now, what's different with Vue, Vue has everything in sort of an HTML single page approach. It's a little bit more like Razor does with CS HTMLs. It has a section called template. That's your HTML. It has a section called script. That's your JavaScript. And it has a section called style. That is your CSS. So those three combined create what's called the .vue file. Very simple. You could take this file, just copy it to a coworker, they can put it in their project, it comes right up. Okay, now, is everybody sitting down? You're sitting down? Good. Okay, because now we're going to go look at Angular. Angular, I think that's a Latin word for more files and more things to do. Got it? So now this one, I'm actually using a different interface here, and I'll show you this in Code Sandbox soon. But I wanted to at least show you the basics. If I go to package.json, oh my goodness, there's a lot more going on. And what Angular has done is it broke itself into lots of little pieces. And that's a good thing because you can load only the ones you need. It's also a bad thing because you have to keep track of which ones you need. And this is how you do it. You have to get everything in your package.json file. Okay, now, does it have an index.js? No. Because most people in the world of Angular use TypeScript. Ah, TypeScript, that's fancy. Well, guess what? TypeScript doesn't import, just like React and Vue does. The difference is I have to make this thing called a platform browser dynamic. I have to do a bootstrap module, and then I'm going to take something and I'm going to use app module. I have no idea what all that means, but it works. And this is their equivalent to what in the other two products is a much simpler way to bootstrap or start up the application. How does index.html look? That's pretty similar. So rather than having a div with an ID of app, they have an element called myApp, and the word loading is what's going to appear until the application pops up. All right. So that was fun. Now what I'm going to do, I want to go into more detail, and I've covered the bootstrap process basically. The only thing I didn't cover is something called app.module. There's an extra step in Angular. So in Angular, I showed you in main.ts, there's a thing called app module. So rather than calling up a page like Vue does, it actually calls a module. What does app module have in it? Well, app module is defined in app module. So I go down here and I go to app module. Aha! So what you have to do in Angular is you have to import everything you're going to use somewhere and make it available to the rest of the application. And you'll see my application is broken up into a bunch of components. So I have to import all of those, and then I have to declare them as either imports. Imports are something I would import from the Angular library, or declarations, those are things I made, I want available, or bootstrap. Bootstrap is where you're going to start. That's your starting point. Now, you'll see if I get far enough along in this talk, I'll show you a fourth thing that you put in here. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to close those three and go show you some new ones. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to jump down and show you These have a little bit different example, but they can show you better how the routing works. Okay, so let's go to React. All right, so the difference here compared to the last one, I'm still doing the silly colors. I'll explain how those happen later. And this is about my code camp that I ran back in March. Same concept. But if you look at the routing here, if I click on schedule, it goes to /schedule/session/speaker. Okay? Well, what does that look like in Vue? If I go to Vue, it does the exact same thing, but Vue seems to be a little bit better at changing colors. You'll understand why in a few seconds. And finally, again, this one's in Code Sandbox, but this one is the Angular version, and the Angular version does the exact same thing. So one of the conclusions you can draw at this time is I could probably make the exact same website with any of these frameworks. It's just a matter of syntax sugar. So what do I want my code to look like? Okay. So let's go look at the beginning of this app. The app starts in something called app. App is a component. We import app from components/app. So we go to the components folder and we open up app.js. And we find that every component in React has to import React. If it's going to use any other subcomponents, it has to import those. It might import a CSS file. If it does that, the CSS file might have things like colors in it. This one does not. Then it creates some markup. And the unusual thing in React is the markup is right in line with your JavaScript code. So you just say, in this case, I'm using a constant function, and I'm going to say that I want app to actually be a div, and inside it I want to have a header, a footer, and a main. And then in the ECMAScript 2015 syntax, I have to then export the app, and that makes the export makes it available to other components so they can talk to each other. I'll explain in a little while why that one has name equals. You'll have to watch what that does. Okay, now, what does the same thing look like in Vue? Well, let's get rid of the sample here. And you'll see, remember in Vue, Vue is going to start at app. And I went to app, and app said, I have to have a div, page header, a router view, and page footer. I have to import my other components. I do that in my script section. And a little bit data difference here. When I do Vue, I create this object that has a name, it has a components, and a data section. And then I have styles. And you'll notice there's no color here. Okay. So, again, almost exactly identical. The difference is syntax. Now, one of the things I have to be specific about, in both Vue and React, what's inside your template must be a single element. And that single element gets constructed in memory and placed in some place on the page. So you have to have an outer wrapper. That's why you'll often see an outer div, and they do the same thing in React. So how does our friend Angular handle this? Well, Angular is going to start, and I tried to show you where the darn start is, in main.ts. Let's just go into app, and there is a thing called app component. Now, this has more to do with TypeScript than Angular, but there's a choice you can make in Angular whether you want to put all the stuff in separate files or one single file. I'm going to show you both techniques. This is an example of storing it in separate files. So app component TS would be my JavaScript for the what is called the app component. The HTML would be this. So where in React and Vue, they were all like in one place, here they put them in separate files. And some people prefer to work that way because the designers can work on the HTML and the CSS. The guys who do the coding can work on the JavaScript. Okay? And finally, the CSS is in a separate file. And all three of those work together. You'll notice in the TSS, or in the app component TS, that it actually calls out the location of the template URL and the style URL to load those in to the component. When you're also in Angular, you're going to be defining something called the component, which of course you have to import from the library, and you have to export the class. Okay, so that's the basics. Now, how does routing work? Routing is how we get things to happen on the URL, so I can go /session/speaker. That is in React, that is stored in main.js. Remember, main's in the middle. So let's go to main.js. And notice that I'm importing switch and route from React Router DOM. What are switch and route? Switch is like a switch statement. And it says, when I present the component main, I want you to check and see what the path is. Depending on the path, I want you to display a different component in the middle of the screen. So you're switching components. That's what a single page application does. For you to switch these 4 components, you have to define them up above. You have to import them. And notice that you use an element called route that says one of my routes is called /schedule. So when I go to /schedule, it's going to go to the component schedule and display it. Now, what do you think schedule looks like? Aha! It's really simple. All it is an element called section with the word schedule in it. And it happens to import some CSS. So that's how it throws the word schedule up on the screen. How does this work in Vue? It's almost identical in concept. But in Vue, instead of having to make a component called main, I have this thing called a router view, because routing is better integrated into Vue. What does a router view do? It basically does a switch. To make it work, we define something called router. And if you look around, I'll show you where that happens. So if we go to, not there. Oh, I already showed you this. So in the beginning of my presentation on Vue, I said there is this thing called router that we're going to inject. And dependency injection is very common in these products. So I'm injecting the router to all components so they all know how to move from one tab or one component to another in the main view. That's how they swap out their images. Now I inject that, but where does it come from? It comes from something called /router. Well, this is a thing you're going to see a lot in Vue, a little bit in React. Router is not a file, it's a folder. So if I go to the folder router, you'll see that index.js is a file in that folder. It defines the routes. So just like React did, it has to import all the components, and then it defines the routes as a JavaScript object, where each route has a path, a name, and a component. Again, just to compare, almost identical thing was done in main.js in React. All right, I know what you're thinking. How do I get this done in Angular? Well, Angular, we got to go find the routing. And in Angular, they make it a little bit extra work. And if you go to your app module where everything is defined, you'll see that I imported a router module. Well, router module is actually stored in a file I made called routingmodule.ts. What does it do? It imports the components. It then makes a JavaScript object defining the paths. But when you use a module in TypeScript in Angular, you have to define it as an ng module, and then you're going to pass it some stuff. You're going to say, well, it's going to be a router module. I want you to load the routes into the root of the application, and I want to export this as routing module. So now, once you've done that, all the components in Angular know all the routes. How do you get the routes to display? Well, the display was not done in main, it was done in the header. So in React, I do it like this. I import link from React Router DOM, and I create a bunch of link tab elements. And they have an attribute called to. So you can link to something. That's all you do. Same concept in Vue. In Vue, I'm going to look at my header, and they use a built-in element called router-link, but in Vue, you don't just use an attribute called to, you prefix the attribute with a, was a bad thing to do. You prefix the attribute with a colon, and that means it's something that you can assign a value to. And when Vue sees that, it will then take this thing here and actually passes a JavaScript object to the to phrase. Okay, and then the last thing I'll show you is almost the exact same thing is done in Angular. So Angular, if I go to header, you will see that it uses router link in square brackets. So it's an attribute, it's not an element. And when you set the router link, you have to pass it a string inside of an array of strings, even though you only have one. Okay, now, just a footnote. Remember I said in Angular you could split everything into multiple files? If it's something small like this, you don't need to do that. Instead, you can just use the word template and give it a string. Now the problem with this, it's very tidy. The problem with this is a lot of editors can't like color code and help you work inside that string. Okay, can somebody tell me what a backtick does in JavaScript? A multi-line string. So the reason I have a backtick there is I want to represent all of my HTML markup so it's readable to me, but I want to put it on separate lines. Normally a string wouldn't do that. So you put a backtick and everything there appears as one string. I can use that same approach for my styles. So just like I showed you in Vue, I can have my source code and my markup and my styles all in one file. And that's common to do in Angular. Okay. So you have some sense there how the routing works. Let's move down to the next step. Okay. Now, in the next step, I want to show you how you might integrate some data into this. So to do that, I'm going to go back to my browser. And I'm going to close these three windows and show you the next step in the progression. And I'll open the React. I'll open the Vue. And I'll open the Angular. Okay, so what did I do different? Let's take a look. So this time, we've added a new tab called Sponsor. And you'll notice that the different tabs in React are all the same color. And I've never been, I do the least amount of work in React. Most of my work is done in Angular for my clients, and I prefer to, on my own personal projects, I prefer Vue. It's not as clean how you load styles into React. You have to sort of load it as a JavaScript module or object, or no, JavaScript module. And anyways, for that reason, I never got the colors to change correctly. But the good news is I can actually throw data on the screen. How do you throw data on the screen, and where did you get the data? Well, let's take a look. Let's go over to the session component. And the session component, really simple what I did. It goes in and it imports something called session data. And it imports that from a file. Now, in the world of React, I actually made the session data. I put it in a folder called data. So I can maneuver to that. And the session data looks like this. It's actually a constant. And the constant has in it a whole bunch of information about our conference that we had 6 months ago. It's just a plain old JSON structure. Okay, since I can load that, what I do then in the world of React is I iterate over it by using, see the little curly braces? So I take session data and I say take all of the items in session data, and I want to map them and basically loop over them. And I assign them, each of the individual sessions, to a variable. And then that variable can be referenced within the markup. So I can get session title, session speaker, session room, session starts at. Pretty simple. And the net result of that is when you click on session, I get a column or list of sessions. Now, how did I make the column stuff? That's magic, and I'll explain that to you when I get to Vue. Okay. How does Vue do this? Well, in Vue, you get the exact same kind of stuff, but the background colors work correctly. And when I change the different tabs, you'll see they all show a different annoying color. Okay, so what did I do in session to make this work? So if I go to component and go to session, you'll see that I do a v-4, and that basically loops through each of the sessions. And then for each of the sessions, I put the field from the JSON object in double curly braces. So React single curlies, Vue is double. Now, where did sessions come from? Well, it's typical to do this. In the world of Vue, you have in your script a JavaScript object which has a data function. The data function has to return something. You can return as much data as you want in here. So I'm using this syntax here. Does anybody know what require does in JavaScript? It loads a file. See, learned something new today. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying going out to the operating system, or in this case, the website, and go load the session.json file that's in the assets folder, and I want you to take the first day of that and give me all the sessions. What does that data look like? It just looks like a plain old JavaScript or a JSON file, data file. Okay, so that was pretty simple. Now, I promised you I'd show you how it does the columns. The columns are all handled by using a trick in CSS. And each view file in view.vue, whoops. Each view file can have a style section, And if you add the attribute scoped, it means that this CSS is only for this component. So the background color I set here won't affect any other component. If each component has its own background color, that's when I change the pages, that's how it changes the colors. Not as easy to do in React. And you'll see, here's the background color. Okay, how did I get the columns? Yes? I don't remember. But they have the concept of global styles and things. It's very similar to what Angular can do in terms of capability. All right. So, anyways, how many of you have ever learned to use Flexbox in CSS? Yeah, you got to look this up. Just take 15 minutes at work next week and do a search for CSS Flexbox and learn how it works. And basically, I added like 1 or 2 words here, and it makes nice tabular columns. Easy to do. Simplest thing in the world. Okay. Can I do the same thing in Angular? Of course you can. You can do all the same things in all the products. You just do them differently. So what did I do in Angular to make this work? Well, in the world of Angular, I have my components in the app, and I go to session.component.ts, and what it does is it loads, using a require statement, it loads the session data. The session data then does a *ng4. So some of the commands in Angular have an asterisk in front of them. If you see an asterisk, it means the command can change the DOM. It can create new DOM elements. So for each of the sessions, I'm going to create a LI, and inside the LI, I'm going to have a div. And just like Vue does, it uses double curly braces. Okay? Notice it has a style section. I can set the color. That's pretty easy. Where's my data? Well, down here, I see that I'm going to assign in the ng-init command, I'm going to assign this .sessions to what session data has in it, and then sessions can be referenced inside my markup. So they're all doing sort of the same thing to iterate, it's just a difference in syntax. Okay? So that's enough about that. I wanted to show you, I missed one thing I wanted to show you called props. Let's talk about props real briefly. So let's go back to React. Okay. In React, when I first showed you this, main did something. I'm sorry, not main. Not index. App. Okay. App did something where it loaded the header, which made the buttons at the top, the center section, and then the bottom, the footer. And the footer is going to be passed some data. When I pass data, that in the world of React and Vue, that's called a property. And if I go into footer, how do I receive that thing called name? It's very simple. I just, in my definition of that particular component, I accept a JavaScript object and I give it a name, and then I can take that name and I can use it and apply it in the markup. So a lot of people like React because it's very small amount of code to get things done, but much harder to read and maintain. Okay, so that's passing a prop in React. How do I pass a prop in our friend Vue? Well, in Vue, what I did is I set text equal to message. Well, what's message? Message is code that I created in my data section. So I have a string called message. I take that and I assign it to something called text. It's just arbitrary what words I picked. Okay, now how does page footer actually receive that prop? When you define page footer, you must define a prop. So I have a prop called text. When it comes in, I can then reuse it and display it inside some HTML. Does anybody think that Angular is less code to do the same thing? I think they're catching on. Good. All right. So in main, no, main isn't what I wanted. It was app component HTML. So in Angular, I created name as an attribute, but I had to pass it something in double curlies. I don't know why it has to be double, it just does. Okay. Now, where does that go? Well, before I show you that, I have to go to app component TS and see that I actually set name and defined it as a string. So it's going to take that string and pass it down to the page footer. How does the page footer consume it? Well, the page footer has to define an input. And the input has to have a name and a type because I'm using TypeScript. So I'm going to receive a string called name. And once I have that string, then I can place the string into my HTML markup. Since I'm using input, I have to remember to also import it at the top so that Angular knows I really want to use an input. All right, next step. I want to show you some data. So the next thing we're going to do, and let me see, we have 13 minutes left. I'll try and go through this quickly. So in the world of JavaScript frameworks and single-page apps, I showed you really simple examples. And in a real world, you would not be loading your data by doing a require statement and loading a JSON file off your site. You would be hitting some kind of service, and the service would probably be hitting a back-end database or something in Azure and returning back the data. In React and Vue, the popular way to do that is called the Flux architecture. How many have heard the term Redux? Okay, so in React, an implementation of Flux is called Redux. In Vue, Flux is called Vuex. They both do the same darn thing. Okay? And then the one that differs, at least right now, is Angular. They took a different approach. They created these things called providers, which are a little more C#-like. But they're actually moving more towards, in their latest version, they're moving more towards the store. So let me show you how a store might work. This is interesting stuff to see. So I'm going to load the 3 up that actually do the data store. So there's React, there's Vue, and there's Angular. Okay, and go to React, and I'll show you, try and whiz through this so you can get to the last step as well. Okay, so we're gonna, so the data doesn't look any different right now, so I'm not going to show you the demo. There's a big difference in the code. So what I do in here, this is Redux. In my dependencies, I add this library called Redux, and I add another library called React Redux. Then I import something called create store and apply middleware. And when I do that, I can take and create what's called the store. We'll be with, you'll see this in a second. Now the difference is, in the world of React, what I do is I wrap the entire router with the provider that has the store in it. Now, what am I trying to accomplish here? So when I wrap app with browser router, it makes the routes accessible to every component in the app. When I wrap browser router with provider, it makes the store accessible to every component in the app. So now I have a central place to put all of my data. It's called the store by convention. Doesn't have to be called that, but that's what most people call it. So what does a store look like? Well, a store is created using a reducer. And there's a lot of code here, and I'll show you in Vue. It's a lot simpler. But basically, what it does is it takes all these files and loads them into variables called schedule, session, speakers, and sponsors. By loading them into the variables, when I need to list all the speakers, what I do is I go to my code here, and I have to add this extra step in React called map state to props. Remember, everything's a prop. And I want to make speakers a prop. And the way I do that is I call the store, which, even though it's called the store, we refer to it as the state, the current state. And state has speakers in it. And what this does is return all the speakers. Once I have all the speakers, then I can iterate through them and show them. So that is the world of Redux. If you don't believe me, I will go to speaker and show you I have all the speakers. Okay. Now, similar thing is done in Vue, but the syntax is much more approachable. So what I do here is I import a store. When I import the store, I then inject it into the entire application. Just like I did with router, the store is a folder, it's not a file. So inside the store, there's a single file called index. And that file creates an object that has something called the state, and it has these things called getters and setters. We're not going to do any setters. You could imagine what they do. But the getters do things like return back the title, the speakers, the sessions. Now, how do I refer to that in my components? It's very simple. Since every component is injected with an instance of the store, if I want to show the speakers, all I need to do is say return this.store.getters.getSpeakers. So that goes to the central data location thing and brings back all the speakers. Once I have all the speakers, I iterate over them just like I would if I loaded them straight off the disk. And the net result, as you can imagine, looks exactly the same. Now, we probably don't have enough time to actually show this in Angular, but I've got 7 minutes left, so let's see if I can help you through this. So in the world of Angular, things get a little more complicated, as you can imagine. You have to create something called a data provider. So let's go into app, and you'll see that I have something called dataservice.ts. Now, everything in TypeScript in Angular is strongly typed. So what I need to do is I need to load things like session. What is session? Session defines the structure of my sessions. Speaker and schedule define the structure of those JSON files. So in my data service, what I'm doing is I'm going out and I'm loading the speakers, the sessions, and the schedules, and then I create methods. And the methods are created in a module, and the module has to be flagged as injectable. This is dependency injection stuff. So data service is injectable. Okay, so where do I define that? Well, remember, everything in Angular revolves around the central module thing that defines all your stuff. So if you look here, you'll see data service is actually defined here, but the difference is it's actually defined as a provider, not a declaration. If it's defined as a provider, then when I go to speaker.component, what I do is I import data service and I inject it code by making a constructor and passing data service in. Once I do that, then in Angular I can reference data service and go out and run my methods to bring back my data. So it's a similar concept to the way the other two do the Flux store. But the net result is exactly the same. When you click your speakers, you get your list of speakers. We have time for one more? Come on, I need some enthusiasm. Let's do it. Woo! Can I do this in 3 seconds, or in 3 minutes? That's the question. Okay, so I'm going to close those three, and I have one more demo I wanted to show you. And this goes down to the next logical level. What if I wanted to have a child component of a session? Let's go see how that was done. Okay, so let me show you how it works, and then I'll try and explain the code. So when I go to sessions, I have a different thing now. I can highlight over a row. Interesting, huh? I think we should pick the one that has me on it. Aha! It actually loads up my detail. If I do a back button, it goes back to the sessions. If I pick this one, it loads that guy. Notice the URL has the ID of the session in it. How did I make that happen? Well, obviously, I had to make a change to session so that it could pass in that information. And what I did is I changed session so that it was a link. Remember the routing stuff? So I'm going to link, any of the rows can link to session detail /ID. And when I do that, somewhere I had to define that that route exists. Does anybody remember where that was? Main.js. So I have a route called session detail, and the colon means this is a parameter I can pass that can be received as a prop. If I go to the session detail JS, I'm going to accept a prop, and I'll show you where that is. This .props.sessions. So it actually goes in and grabs and goes and does a query and returns back a single session. The exact same thing can happen in Vue. If I go to the sessions here and I highlight, I got the exact same. See, Vue actually responds pretty fast. Now, Vue would be a little easier to understand. And I say that in this sense. If I go to components and go to session, it's pretty obvious here. I'm going to do a to. And then I'm going to render this as an LI, even though I made it a router link. And then each of the rows can now point to a different route. And how did I have to pass the data? Well, I didn't have to do anything here. Just in session detail view, I had to accept the data. And to accept the data, I say I have a prop called ID. And since the URL is passing me an ID, it automatically gets put into my props, and I use that, I use that to call the store, and when I go to the store, I say, pass the ID to the store, so it returns back one session. All right. So, in closing, we learned of the three frameworks, React is the most popular. Angular is probably the largest and most flexible, does the most stuff. And and Vue is the newest, a little bit faster. We also learned that all of them are based on components. All of them have to bootstrap in a similar fashion. All of them can have HTML, code, and CSS that defines what the World Wide Web calls a component. The reason you use these things is to make applications where you're going to change views. That's called a single page application. And once you learn to make the components, switching from one to the other is just a matter of learning the syntax differences. So I would recommend that you use something like Code Sandbox. That website allows you to make examples in different in React, in Vue, in Angular, and then study the code differences and save them and share them with your coworkers. So hopefully it's crystal clear to you now. I'll take any questions. Yes, sir. Yes. Yes, you can. And you can use TypeScript in Vue. It's just a coding preference about whether you want to use. I'm a big fan of TypeScript, not only because it came from Microsoft, but it feels more C#-like, and the data typing really helps you to avoid mistakes. Now, what's going to happen when they switched Angular to the newer versions, they embraced TypeScript. Right now, Vue is at 2.5. What do you think they're writing Vue 3.0 in? TypeScript. And I know this is hard to stomach, but what do you think a lot of the coders at Google use? TypeScript. Right. So it's just a better way to present your JavaScript stuff. Any other questions? Yes. Could we take a question? How many think we should take a question online? No. Offline, so I get off the stage. Absolutely, I can do that. One more question. Anybody? One more question before I get kicked off. Yes, sir. Yes, they all do the same kind of applications. So, all right. This is fun. Thanks, and have a good day.